Welcome to Trial Site News Podcast Series. We are thrilled and honored to introduce Dr. Thomas Pitts on the show today. As Director of Neurology at Hudson Medical in New York, he heroically saved a woman's life back in April during the apex of the pandemic. Now, Dr. Pitts connected with a mother of three and respiratory therapist who at one point was intubated for 16 days, sick with a severe to approaching critical form of COVID-19. Thankfully, though, Amy de Vos, doctor, heard about a study involving Dr. Pitts, who included Ms. de Vos in the small emergency-approved study, and the rest is history. The patient is alive today, and thanks to this study and clinical investigator. So, Dr. Pitts, welcome. It is an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for the warm introduction. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, we're proud of the work you're doing, and been fascinating to watch. So let's take a step back. Back in April, we first wrote about this story and received tremendous positive feedback and requests to include you on this show. We started to commence this interview by asking how you got involved in medicine. At what point as a youth or a while back did you decide this was the direction you wanted to follow?
Well, I was kind of a late comer to the medical world. My parents, neither one of them went to college. I'm the first one other than my sister to attend college in my family. And I actually started off as a business major. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So I figured, well, I'll go ahead and kind of join a somewhat catch-all, major and then maybe sort it out after the fact. My mom is actually an immigrant from Spain, so I don't come from a long line of doctors or anything like that. It wasn't until about my sophomore year that I just kind of fell in love with the sciences and said, wow, how is it that I do this? And I wandered over to the pre-med advisor who kind of said, well, look, if you accomplish these, although arduous, if you accomplish these milestones, you will be able to take the MCAT and go to medical school. So I shadowed a few doctors, and the first time I saw humans helping other humans in that capacity, I said, you know what, this is the direction for me, and this is something I want to be a part of, something much bigger than me. And I ended up completing the marketing major because I was so far along in it. But I actually spent a fifth year in undergrad completing a chemistry degree, a biology minor, and a marketing degree before being accepted to medical school.
It's a wonderful thing to have something that you're passionate about. Not everyone gets to find what they're passionate about and make a career out of doing it.
I've been truly blessed because to me, there's nothing else I'd rather wake up every day and do than help people. And I have a kind of a unique backstage pass at humanity. And I think while certainly it's always the worst situation when a loved one is sick, you really get to see humans perform at their finest. It's society at its finest. Strangers in the waiting room helping each other, families giving rides to and fro to their home, back to the hospital, people of all walks of life interacting together to make sure that maybe, even just one person gets better. And so it's an honor to be a part of every day.
Yes, it's certainly a place where you get to see a lot of great human interaction that you don't always see elsewhere. So, to those who don't know in the audience, only about 4% of all physicians in the USA serve as research investigators. Now, as your practice ramped up, what initially got you interested in research?
To be completely honest, and this is sacrilegious as someone who was a chemistry major, I spent a summer after my first year in medical school in an ophthalmology lab at Bascom Palmer Ophthalmology. It's one of the world's greatest ophthalmology institutions at the University of Miami. They were kind enough to have me, and I spent the summer dissecting cow and pig eyes in an effort to discover research on corneal epithelial transplants. And I have to tell you, it was a great experience, but I said, never again. I'm never going to be relinquished to the lab full time. So I had pretty much said, well, look, I'm happy to, do what I have to do in training, familiarize myself with research, but I just don't have research in my blood. I want to be at the bedside. I'm a clinician. However, clinical research started to appeal to me. I think what happens is when you're, and maybe I would use a surgeon as an example. A surgeon might be using a device, maybe an orthopedic surgeon or a neurosurgeon is doing a spine surgery, and they have a challenge that they're constantly presented with. And they look at their toolbox and say, these are the only 4 surgical screws I have to work with. I wish I had one that was a little bit longer and a little bit fatter to work with. And maybe they develop that tool, or maybe they repurpose another tool that they have and say, you know what, I'll bet I could use, I presented a case. I was fortunate to work with a very, very complicated case in a young patient with an aneurysm. And we use stents in the vasculature of the head and neck to divert blood flow out of an aneurysm so they don't rupture. And I was thankful enough to write up a case about a patient that we actually used a Joe stent, which is a cardiac stent, in the carotid artery in the head, approaching the cerebral vasculature, because it was the only one that would fit. So I started to find a niche in clinical research. I said, you know, I don't think I'm destined for the laboratory, but there are times when I, for example, find a migraine medicine and say, you know what, I think it would work for this other type of headache. Or in this case, an immunologic modulating medicine, and say, you know what, this wasn't what it was purposed for, but I find that this other area is deficient, and maybe we can fill the void with this existing tool that I've familiarized myself with, albeit in a different capacity. So I didn't have any hopes of being a researcher. I don't plan on making a living, you know, getting grants and being relinquished to the lab. I'm so thrilled we have those folks out there. But I'm a clinician by heart, but I think that it kind of threw itself upon me. I don't think I went out seeking it. So clinical research kind of found me, I think, in the process of doing my clinical duties rather than me aspiring to be a researcher.
So what about the coronaviruses? What got your attention?
You know, I have to tell you, virology is a very interesting part of neurology. So I am never the guy that takes care of the virus. That's your internal medicine doctor. That's your infectious disease doctor, your urgent care doctor. Those are your cough, cold doctors, right? Neurologists are not cough, cold doctors. That's not what we do. But not infrequently, the viruses that we encounter every day, coronaviruses, rhinoviruses, any parent who has taken their kiddo to a daycare knows the joy of having a rotavirus, like a stomach bug, you know, they cause neurologic problems down the road. A very common one that people may have heard of is Guillain-Barré syndrome. So you get a virus or maybe even a bacteria, Campylobacter, and it goes away. But then all of a sudden you end up somehow on a ventilator. You end up unable to move, numb, and it can certainly kill someone. Now, how does that happen? Well, that virus or that bacteria that the patient is exposed to obviously activates their immune system, which is a very appropriate thing to have happen. That's what you want to have happen to fight it off. But in the process of this, there's a certain group of people that actually their immune system disproportionately and often misguided in the process of attacking that pathogen or foreign invader, the virus, it goes on to attack itself. So imagine I always picture the bank robbery, you know, and the cops storm in and they go to shoot the bad guy. And, you know, in the process of that, maybe they accidentally shoot the bank guard. So they had a response against the bad guy, but unfortunately in the process of doing that, they actually injured or killed a good guy. And so we deal with that as neurologists. We dim down the immune system when this happens. So there are several viruses that can cause, you know, worsen multiple sclerosis. There are viruses that can cause Guillain-Barré syndrome. And sometimes that immune system response can persist for the rest of their life. There's a disease called CIDP, chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyradicular neuropathy. That's a mouthful. It's a chronic Guillain-Barré. Those patients, although they've cleared the virus for the rest of their life, have to undergo immunologic therapy to dim down their immune response, because their immune response is forever going to perceive their nervous system as a bad guy. So I'm on the tail end of it. I don't have an inherent interest in viruses, but I regularly pick up the pieces to the catastrophic damage that they cause. And that's through a misguided immune response, which is both prolonged even after the virus has left, and unfortunately catastrophic, usually causing much more damage than the virus itself.
So what made you start investigating this expensive immunosuppressive drug to treat paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria and atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome? Well,
so, you know, going back to kind of how does a neurologist become involved with the virus? Well, I talked about I'm really involved in immune responses. And so I actually treat, you know, you've listed 2 of the 4 FDA approvals for Soliris. So there's paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria and atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome, which the cool kids in hematology and oncology call PNH and AHUS respectively. I do not treat those diseases. However, there are two neuroautoimmune diseases that I do treat. In fact, they're my passion. One is generalized myasthenia gravis with acetylcholine receptor antibodies. This is an autoimmune disease that attacks the communication between the nerve and the muscle, rendering patients weak, sometimes to the point that they require a ventilator, and frankly, they can pass away from this problem. The other is called aquaporin 4-channel antibody positive neuromyelitis optica, sometimes referred to as Devick's disease, which was thought to be a fatal or catastrophic form of multiple sclerosis. Down the road, we later found out that in fact it's its own entity. And so these are what we call complement-mediated diseases. So the complement is a part of the immune system. The immune system is a blanket term. I always use the example. It's kind of like the military, that is a blanket term for several organizations. You have the Navy, the Marines, the Army, you name it. And underneath each one of those umbrellas, they have their own sub-organizations, like, the Navy SEALs or what have you. And so the complement is one part of the immune system. So part of my job is I line up, when someone has an autoimmune disease, I try to figure out which autoimmune disease it is, and then basically say, okay, what part of your immune system is going haywire? And then what medication do I have that can dim just that part of the immune system down? Because I don't want to generally dim your immune system and leave you susceptible to infections. So anyway, I use Solaris or eculizumab regularly to treat myasthenia gravis. And a big shout out to the Myasthenia Gravis Foundation of America here in New York City. I'm one of their partner providers. I'm very proud to represent that patient population. That is my life's goal, is to fix myasthenia gravis and treat this population. That's what I do. So I use it for neuromyelitis optica. So I'm very familiar with the medicine and the mechanism of action. When I heard about the coronavirus, and I heard about it from one of our fellows, and for those who don't know, a fellow is someone who has completed a residency or post-med school training in a specialty, and then goes on to become a subspecialist. So like, you can complete an orthopedic surgery residency, but maybe you want to do a fellowship in knee or shoulder, you name it. So he was giving a talk about something totally unrelated to us. And then at the end, it turns out his brother actually was married to a woman from Wuhan, China. And this was in the infancy of the coronavirus, like maybe mid to early-ish February, I think February 18th. And actually in New York, I don't think we had any known cases at the time. And so he tells me, I'm kind of like, he had I always joke, he had a 99 slide PowerPoint on a Friday morning. So I was almost like, kind of just struggling to stay focused, 99 slides. And then at the end, I perked up because he said the coronavirus causes this massive, in some people, it causes this massive lung inflammation called acute respiratory distress syndrome. And I said, wait a minute, that's an immune response. That there is no coronavirus that's going to do that. A coronavirus is the cold. That's the wimpiest virus on the block as a family, right? I interact on the New York City subway. I probably interact with multiple types of coronaviruses on a daily basis, amongst other things, rhinoviruses, you name it. So then why do some people end up going into this ARDS? And furthermore, what we found was almost 100%, like 87 to 97% of people, although it was a small group of people in the overall COVID-19 population, when they did have this problem and ended up on a ventilator or breathing machine, like 87 to 97% of them died. So it was a very small group relative to the population that was ending up on a ventilator. But when they did, it was essentially a death sentence. And when you see that happen, the first thing that popped into my head is, this is an immune response for sure. So everybody's going after the virus. To this day, I'm seeing infectious disease doctors just talk about the virus and the virus and the virus, and that's okay. I'm all for a vaccine, and if you want to use an antiviral, that's fine. But what people should know, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, is that the immune response is going to persist in these critically ill patients even after the virus has left their system. The high value target, it occurred to me immediately, was to dim down the immune response. You can fight off a coronavirus on your own. And in fact, most people do. They're at home, cough, cold, malaise, and then they get better. That's most people. But then there's this group of people that get sick and end up on a ventilator and die. And that's from their immune response. And again, I just want to shoot down, a lot of people are like, well, what can I do to boost my immune system? This is not a disease of immunodeficient people at all. There is no evidence whatsoever. And there's so many people, right? 100,000 Americans dead. Immunodeficiencies are extremely rare. These are not people who didn't have an immune system. These are people who had an overactive immune system. And a misguided immune system. So I looked at this and said, okay, what can I find on this immune response in the SARS coronavirus from 2003, around there, 2004, because that's the closest thing we had at the time. And I found that the complement, my goal there was, well, what part of the immune system is acting? I can take out my armamentum of different immunosuppressive drugs and line it up and say, okay, if it's the T cells, I can inhibit those. If it's the B cells, I can inhibit those. It looked like it was the complement. And I said, great, I use Solaris regularly, eculizumab. I'm going to use that to dim down the immune system and try to save some lives here when people go beyond the viremia. To quote the great Dr. Elena Mikhailov, this is beyond the viremia, and actually dim down their immune system, because the coronavirus isn't killing them. It's provoking their immune system to kill them. So dim down the immune system, let them fight off the virus naturally like they would anyway, and hopefully they go home with a happy ending. So that's how this happened.
Well, yeah, and you hit the nail on the head. You can take a look at any autoimmune disease, say lupus, where it attacks your vital organs thinking that they are the disease. And that's not because the immune system isn't active. It's crazy overactive, and it's just misguided on what it's going to attack.
You nailed it too. I mean, and it's crazy because we still hear that verbiage, immunocompromised, and older people are immunocompromised. Older people are not dying because they're immunocompromised. I mean, true immune activity diminishes slightly over the years. But when in the medical world, when you say immunocompromised, I mean, you're talking about an AIDS patient, someone who has like a CD4 or a T cell count below 200, or someone who has like common variable immunodeficiency. They have no immune system and they're just getting six pneumonias in a year. Older people are dying because they can't tolerate being sick like an 18-year-old can. If you become septic and your heart rate goes up to 180 and your blood pressure goes down to 60/40, an 18-year-old can tolerate that for some degree of time. An 86-year-old with diabetes and 6 coronary stents and a history of bypass cannot. They will have a lethal arrhythmia. So older people, this is not, just like you said, it's crazy overactive immune system. It's not from immunodeficient people. That's the first, to me, misconception that showed a kind of a global, not to generalize with everybody, but a large kind of global misunderstanding of what we're dealing with. And I still to this day hear that saying, these are immunocompromised people and we need to boost the immune system. We need to turn the immune system down in a lot of cases.
So let's shift then back to Amy de Vos' situation. It was scary. She was in the hospital, intubated, and not doing well. And according to reports, her family had even said their goodbyes to her. How did you precisely get involved?
This is the worst situation that can happen in medicine. I think, not to trivialize anyone's life, but I think we all as humans can agree, a mom and a child. When you hear a mom is going to pass away, a young mom, who, by the way, on a kind of a nostalgic note as a physician, here she is getting sick because she's a respiratory therapist. She's saving people's lives. She's out here in the middle of a virus, doesn't back down at all. She could have called in sick. Any of us could have, I guess, or quit her job even. She didn't. She's putting, if I had gotten sick, someone like her would have put a breathing tube in me. So she's out there being a hero. She gets sick, ends up on a ventilator. I had privileges at that hospital in Dayton, Ohio. I had the privilege of completing my fellowship at Columbia University here in New York. But prior to that, I did my medical school neurology residency at a place called Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, which I'm very proud of. The best med school around, if you ask me. And frankly, it's also associated with a wonderful hospital system called Premier Health. Premier Health is a major network there in Dayton, Ohio, but it also has more rural hospitals out in Troy, for example, where she was located, Upper Valley Medical Center. Because it's a rural hospital, sometimes specialist services are scarce. So I'm on staff. I'm part of a team called the Neuro One team. It's a teleneurology team. I read electroencephalograms, studies EEGs, which are kind of like brainwave tests. They're kind of an EKG for the brain, seizure patients. And I also do teleneurology consultations a weekend or two every month just to help out. And it's an honor. So I am on staff at that hospital. Dr. Elena Mikhailov, who is one of the best neurologists I've ever met, I'm biased because she was my attending our boss physician when I was a medical student and resident, so I'm a little biased, but she actually trained me to be a neurologist. One of the most up-to-date neurologists I've ever met. She's always doing something cutting edge. And ironically, I had put this study out on clinicaltrial.gov based on an idea. I'm not sponsored by, I don't work for a pharma company or anything like that. It's just me. And I was sitting there, no drug, no patients, nothing. I wasn't even sure how to get the word out. And she calls me and says, listen, Tom, I got a patient here who's going to die. Her family's come in. They basically said the last rites. They let them into a quarantine area. So that gives you some idea of how serious it was. They've said goodbye. Is there anything you can do? We got an infectious disease doctor on the case. We got a pulmonary crick care doctor on the case. They've kept her alive, but she's getting worse. And they've, although valiant, they've exhausted what they can do for her. What can you do? And I said, you know what? I have this trial. And she knew about the trial because she's up to date. And I said, we can complement inhibitors, or inhibit her and see if this helps. She had whited out lungs. I mean, her lungs were entirely, when I say whited out, you could not force air into the lung even with a ventilator. So even with a ventilator, her oxygen level in the arterial blood was about 71%. She had a seizure because of a low oxygen level, which is why the neurology team was involved. She called me, and we were able to work with some of the most outstanding. When you talk about hospital administration, it varies from site to site. And while everybody's well-intentioned, administration sometimes in the process of doing their administrative duties can get in your way. That is the opposite of what happened. Dr. Mark Belcastro has my highest respect. He's a neonatologist by training. He's the chief medical officer of the entire system. And he, what I call, bulldozed the bureaucracy. He deserves credit for saving a life as much as any of us, because without someone like that, what I've found is you're just going to have a wall of people standing in your way with a bunch of bureaucracy that will prevent you from implementing therapy in a timely manner, and the patient will probably die. So he bulldozed the bureaucracy. It came from the top down. We were able to get her the medicine that night. 3 hours later, I was able to get an FDA emergency approval. I was able to get Alexion, the manufacturer, to submit a permission letter to experiment with their medication, which is required.
Right.
I was able to get the Alexion to coordinate with the main pharmacy to ship the drug out, so it would be replaced. We used an existing medication at the main hospital in Premier Health and had it brought by ambulance out to the rural hospital in Troy, Ohio, from Dayton, Ohio. And it was intervened about 3 hours later. And within 4 hours, and I'm working on publishing this work, but I have some dramatic x-ray pictures. Within 4 hours, you see aeration of the top left lung, and then the rest is history. She improved almost every day from there. Her fever went away. She had a fever up to about 103. Oxygen level improved. We were able to ventilate her with the mechanical ventilator, whereas before we couldn't. We were able to turn her from a face-down position to a face-up position. And we were able to remove medicines called pressors, which support the blood pressure. Actually, on her own, her blood pressure was so low, very common in an infection, that she would have had cardiovascular collapse and died. So she was requiring basically adrenaline, norepinephrine, or Levophed to keep her blood pressure, into the normal range enough to get blood to her vital organs. So we saw a pretty rapid turnaround, and the rest is history.
So, for the edification of our audience, let's talk about the complement that was attacking Amy de Vos's lungs. Could you talk about what it is about COVID-19 that goes after a certain percentage of a patient's lungs, that percentage of patients that are at risk for acute respiratory distress syndrome, which can lead to a cytokine storm? Could you explain to the audience what this condition is and how it works?
Thank you for asking. This is huge because, so the first thing I would say to you is that what makes COVID-19 unique in the way it kills people, right? Because when it makes people sick, the majority of people, it acts like any other coronavirus. You get a cough, cold, malaise. There are some unique features. It invades the olfactory tract, but that is described in other viral illnesses where people have smell or taste problems. So that's not entirely unique to a virus. That being said, we're seeing all this other stuff happen, right? I mean, so we're seeing strokes and pulmonary embolisms or blood clots in the lungs. We're seeing, all these different things happen. And that is when the immune system becomes involved. So the coronavirus entering the lung is not in itself too abnormal. I mean, we've all had a viral kind of bronchitis before, cough, kind of coughing up gunk or sputum. That's not quite a pneumonia, or there's no clear bacterial pathogen. That's probably a viral bronchitis or viral airway disease. However, when you go into the acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, that is when it is activating the complement. And part of complement activation, and I want to shout it from the rooftop, again, it shows a gross misunderstanding of the problem. Complement activation activates platelets, which are clotting factors, and cause endothelial damage or damage to the blood vessel, the wall. That's why these patients are having blood clots. And that's why those blood clots, if they travel to the heart, they have a heart attack. If they go to the lung, they have a pulmonary embolism. And if they go to the brain, they have a stroke. Because of a gross misunderstanding of this process and looking at it as a virus rather than an immune response in these critically ill patients, people are confused. They're saying, wow, why do we have strokes and lung problems? That can be daunting. I mean, if you separate a salad into, it's a salad. It's a hoshposh of things, but it's one entity. The complement is activating when the virus is in the lung, and is provoked by a molecule called C1q. C1q is an immunosurveillance molecule, which actually is a very helpful thing to have. The complement, what makes things worse about this situation is only supposed to typically be brought in encapsulated bacterial infections like Neisseria meningitis, so life-threatening, typically bacterial infections. So it really has no business fighting off a coronavirus at all. However, when it is activated, it forms something called the membrane attack complex, or the terminal complement complex, which is kind of like an immunologic mega soldier. It forms these different components, C5 all the way through C9, and it picture like one of those snap together toys that the kids have. It forms this big Megatron guy. Well, that's what it is. And what it does is it will actually, if you activate the membrane attack complex, it will actually destroy the tissue that the pathogen or target is embedded in a process to get it out. The way your body makes that decision is through a surveillance molecule called C1q. There are certain characteristics that would allow or convince C1q to activate the complement. So in certain people, their COVID is, there may be a different strand than someone else. So just like the flu, we see different strands that may have certain characteristics, IgG type molecules on the surface that provoke the complement. It may be causing more damage than may actually be causing lung irritation to the point that the body freaks out and calls in the complement. But for whatever reason, it activates C1q to cause the complement cascade to occur. So C1q mobilizes down its pathways, C2, C3. Eventually it gets to C5, which converts to C5a. C5a actually causes the cytokine storm. So another coloring book term, and again, I think it shows a less than optimal understanding of this response. And by the way, this isn't to knock anybody. Infectious disease doctors are heroes, but they're not immunologists, and they're the ones trying to explain this to the general community. I've yet to see a daily, Dr. Fauci, I believe, is an immunologist, but I just don't see people who are kind of current world-renowned experts in immunology up there on the podium giving the press conference, So it's like me trying to explain ophthalmology the best I can. It's going to be a little bit coloring book. So the cytokine storm is a very coloring book term. Cytokines, interleukins, complement, plasma cells, they're all part of this immune response. And so cytokine storm is a downward path that's typically activated when C5a gets into kind of a cycle with C3. At the same time, C5b combines all the way to C9 and forms this mega soldier called the MAC. So when the complement is activated, it causes the quote unquote cytokine storm. It causes the membrane attack complex to actually destroy the tissue of the lung, causing acute respiratory distress syndrome. And it's causing platelet activation, endothelial damage, which is causing blood clotting, which is causing the strokes and pulmonary embolisms that we're seeing. So, in certain people, it's activating the complement. And that's by the way, that's the same with Guillain-Barré, right? Not everybody who gets a virus gets Guillain-Barré. In fact, the majority don't. But again, when they do get it, they typically end up on a ventilator. Same thing here. Most people do not end up on a ventilator with COVID. But when they do, they tend to die. And that's because this is one of the most lethal catastrophic immune responses the body can mount. It will destroy the lung in the process, ironically, of trying to save the lung. And so that is how the complement becomes involved. The cytokine storm, in my opinion, is a suboptimal target. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but some of the agents going after the cytokines, I think, are suboptimal. I think a better target would be to go after the complement, where you can actually indirectly inhibit the cytokine storm through inhibition of C5a in the loop with C3, while also inhibiting the membrane attack complex. So I think with the complement inhibition, you would help with the blood clots. I think you'd help with the cytokine storm, and I think you would help with the end organ damage, such as acute respiratory distress syndrome caused by the membrane attack complex of the complement.
In other words, hitting the root cause.
Hitting the root cause. You got it, my friend. That's exactly right.
Now, you touched on this earlier, but the immunosuppressive Soliris is a potential treatment. Can you expand on what tipped you off that this drug could potentially work on the critical COVID-19 cases?
Absolutely. I mean, I am just so blessed. You know, I'm only a few years out of my fellowship training. You know, I'm not a 30-year guy, you know, but because I've tried to take on some of these huge diseases and these tough diseases, they've always fascinated me, and you can really make a difference in someone's life. There's usually a 5 to 7 year delay diagnosis, for example, in myasthenia gravis. It's just not recognized. It's not on doctors' radars typically because it is ultra rare. But that being said, when you start to work with these drugs and these processes, you really start to understand the immune system. And when you see the immune system act, you recognize it. So when I saw COVID patients who had died versus COVID patients who were at home with a fever, I said, what's the difference? They all have COVID. Well, when you start to see the x-ray, it looks just like a catastrophic immune response. So I knew there was an immune response, as I mentioned, and I said, well, now it's just a matter of finding out what immunologic players are acting and how do I dim down or mute those parts without inhibiting the ability to fight the virus. I researched a couple papers. There's a couple wonderful patients on the SARS coronavirus of 2003 and 4, and found that complement was found in deceased patients in the postmortem studies. And also I have to give a big shout out to my colleague in Austria, Dr. Reinhold Wurzner. That's Wurzner with an umlaut. And he actually corresponded with me after I found this. I kind of had this idea and launched it on clinicaltrial.gov. He went ahead and said, you know what, Tom, I'm giving a slightly modified version of COVID-19 to mice. And when I'm dissecting them, I'm finding complement in their tracheal and lung fluid. So you're on the right track. Keep going. In fact, I've had an overwhelming response. I've had chairman level responses from some of our nation's most prestigious and worlds, actually, as far as Lithuania, you know, Italy, the Middle East, Africa, saying, how do we become part of this? Because we, you know, now that you say this, we really think that this is something. And so it was not only my theory, it was also having this reinforcement from other immunologic experts, and then substantiated by Dr. Wurzner's mice models, and then some of the other papers from the coronavirus, SARS coronavirus of yesteryear, 2003, 2004, that really led me to think we have enough data here to go forward with this. And then also the fact that Soliris, although not FDA approved or trialed in COVID prior to my study, you know, it does have safety data through 4, you know, other FDA indications. So it's a relatively safe drug to use. So I said, well, gosh, I don't know that we can hurt somebody more than, you know, an 87 to 97% mortality, which is what they're facing right now, right? People talk about a control group. I said, well, you have your control group, right? I mean, they die when they're on the ventilator. Typically, they die. So it's hard to do worse than dying. So I said, well, gosh, I can't imagine that I would ever cause more damage with this drug, especially given the robust safety data we have in other indications. And the mechanism makes sense here. I mean, we're literally finding it in the tracheal and lung fluid of mice, and we're finding it in the SARS coronavirus patients who had died, unfortunately, in the coronavirus of yesteryear. Let's go ahead and do this. So that's how this happened.
So you touched on the challenge to secure approvals that you needed. Now, we are grateful for your commitment, dedication, and service to patients. Could you walk the audience through, many of who are physicians, that may want to get into research, as to a couple of things that you learned about research that you didn't know before all of this?
Well, thank you for asking. I can tell you, you won't have less gray hair if you enter this arena. That being said, you know, it's well worth it because you really can change the game for folks. So, you The first thing I can tell you is there's a lot of stuff that has to happen, and it's not easily accessible. Like, for example, so I'm just a schmo here in Manhattan. I'm no Harvard PhD, or I don't have $1 billion research department behind me. I'm in my living room. I just have an idea. And I've always said, one great thing that I've always grew up, thinking about America was that all you need is an idea, and we'll make it happen. We put people on the moon based on an idea. So I believe that. And I think that's what drives you. So you have to just know your idea can become a reality. Now, those steps are extremely difficult because they're not well spelled out. Unless you do this every day, it's like, who do I call? How do I make this an idea while I'm sitting here on a Starbucks table in Bleecker Street, New York? I mean, how do I get this to the people that need to know it? So I call the CDC, not to disparage their prior excellent work. If you're listening, CDC, what an atrocious call center you have. Not to disparage the men and women that work there, but what an atrocious call center you have. I called them and said, I have a clinicaltrial.gov approved study. Here's my national provider identification number. You can Google me. I mean, you can look up any doctor. I have a license number. I'm licensed in 5 states. And I said, read my proposal. All I wanted to do was talk to someone on the COVID team, this is in early February, to run this by them. I was even willing at the time to have them kind of take it over and say, listen, where can I use this? Help me out. I couldn't get past the call center. I talked to probably 4 people who just wouldn't connect me to someone. They just said, you know what, we'll send you an email response. And I'd get these generic email responses, like as if I was a patient. If you are looking for care, contact your local doctor, kind of thing. No, it was horrible. I even had a call center guy at the CDC with no medical training whatsoever try to take me on about that. Well, let me play devil's advocate. If you have a treatment, I mean, why aren't you treating people with it? I'm like, well, that's why I'm calling you. The FDA was different. They were very helpful. Big shout out to the FDA. I called a pharmacist there and I said, listen, I have an idea. I need help. I don't really know how to do this. How do you get a clinical trial going? How does that happen? And he said, well, he walked me through the emergency IND process, where you serve as a sponsor and investigator. Now I'm in kind of an interesting situation because Solaris, you have to be REMS certified, which is risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. You have to be certified to give it. So the patients we were giving it to, sometimes their pulmonary critical care doctor was not actually in all cases was not certified. So I had to be on the team, basically join their treatment team in order for them to even begin to give the medicine. They couldn't give it. So I joined the team of every single one of these patients. After that, once you get an EIND for a patient, you have to get a letter of authorization from Alexion, the manufacturer, that says you are allowed to experiment with our medication. You have to send that to the FDA. They will review it and they will approve it, hopefully. When they approve it, you then go back to Alexion and say, okay, I have the approval. They send a contract to the hospital where the patient is, who has to sign it. And basically it just says, look, it's kind of a formality, we are not giving you a gift. This is not for your private office stash or something like that. You cannot collect money from this. You are using this for this trial. And if you don't use it, you got to send it back. But we will provide you medicine for this study, if you're going to use it for this purpose. And my hat goes off to Alexion because they did provide that medicine at no cost, and they reimburse people they replenish their stock if they use it. So they've been extremely helpful in this process. That being said, learning this and doing this was hard. I mean, I had regulatory inquiries from the FDA. We had to request it to get sent over to the hematology department. I mean, the infectious disease team just basically had no idea. They were like, well, why is a neurologist on a lung patient's case? They would actually give me a formal inquiry I had to answer, basically an interrogation,
right?
Which I understand. And I'd have to answer that. So what I would say to someone going into research is, if you have help, it's really great. If you're alone, it's awfully lonely. And most people who you interact with are kind of not going to be very helpful, to be honest. I ran into a lot of bureaucracy. I ran into a lot of walls. I ran into a lot of naysayers. The good news is that when you actually run into someone who actually knows what they're talking about, when you run into a chief of immunology or a department chair, they've looked at this and said, oh no, that's a good idea, let's do this. I've yet to have a physician tell me that it was a bad idea. So you have to weed through the lawyers, you have to weed through the institutional review boards, you have to weed through the administration of each hospital, you have to weed through the FDA, you have to weed through the logistics of getting the medicine there. So you're going to learn on the fly, you're going to get some gray hairs, but what I would also tell you is it is infinitely worth it. If you get someone off that ventilator and home to their family, there's nothing you can do that, in my opinion, that can top that.
Any tips then for independent researchers navigating government regulators?
I'd say get yourself a buddy. If you can call them and say, I'm transparent. I said, listen, I don't know what I'm doing. My intentions are good. I promise they're not malicious. If I don't cross a T or dot an I, it's because I've never done this. But I have this idea and I believe it'll work. And I need you to help me walk through. They will usually help you. I think if you try to be the all-knowing physician and do it, you make a mistake, you can get in big trouble apparently for that. And so ask for help. I have to give a big shout out to a physician who was one of my attendings, Dr. Thomas Brannigan at Columbia University. He's not directly involved in the trial, but I reached out to him because I trust his opinion. He's a phenomenal researcher. And, he spoke to me a little bit about kind of my idea and I ran it by him. So I think run it by people, make sure the idea is legit, and then just ask for help. And then you got to be a squeaky wheel, because if you're not a squeaky wheel, what I found is that stuff just sits on people's desks. But if you connect with that decision maker that's willing to help you, get with that person and just keep going. Don't ever give up. These patients are depending on us. And I don't know why these people who kind of stand in our way are there. I think they think they're doing their job, and that's fine. But if you are not a squeaky wheel and you cannot deal with bureaucracy, you will never get your idea through. But again, if you do, it's infinitely worth it. So just keep going. Don't ever give up.
So back then to COVID-19, what do you think the prospects are for a vaccine as well as for more advanced treatments?
Oh, that's the hope. I mean, the vaccine is the hope. I'm here dealing with it on the back end. You get I can't stop you from getting the virus. Then again, it's an arduous task, right? Because a coronavirus is the common cold. So we've always said, well, you can't cure the common cold, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine that you completely eliminate the COVID-19. I mean, I hope we do. I hope a vaccine does work. But just like influenza, I worry that, when we put out the flu shot, we're basically making an educated guess on the most common strands. And if you don't happen to have one of those, you get the flu and people get all upset. I got the flu shot, but I got the flu anyway, especially with the use of a lot of these antivirals. I don't know if we're mutating the virus. I'm not sure. But that being said, a vaccine would be ideal, right? Because if you don't ever get the virus, you won't end up in the situation where you're on the ventilator.
So let's talk about comorbidities. Do patients that have other issues such as diabetes, high blood pressure, autoimmune diseases, or obesity face more risk?
It's an excellent question. It's a complicated answer. Here's what I could tell you. Obesity, diabetes, the vascular complications like the cardiovascular risk factors, hypertension, blood pressure, they do not have a higher risk of going on a ventilator or getting COVID. They are not immunosuppressed people. However, if they get sick with those comorbid conditions, and I'm talking sick like they end up on a ventilator, they're going to have a harder time surviving because they have comorbid medical conditions. So if I already have cardiac stents and high blood pressure, damage to my blood vessels, as soon as my heart rate goes, if I'm 85 and I have a bunch of medical problems and my heart rate goes up to 180 because I'm septic, I'm probably going to go into VTAC and then probably VFib, which are lethal arrhythmias, VFib cardiac arrest, and die. Again, an 18-year-old who's kind of a medical clean slate, if you will, they could probably survive that better. So comorbid conditions to me make it harder to survive being sick, which is why they're dying in a higher proportion. By the way, that's why the highest proportion of people who die of natural causes are old, right? They have comorbid medical conditions. It's very rare to see an 18-year-old just spontaneously die. A 98-year-old dies in their sleep all the time. That's because they have comorbid medical conditions and eventually they have organ failure. So no, from the cardiovascular stroke kind of risk factor family. Autoimmune disease is a different story. Again, an autoimmune patient is not typically deficient. Even in lupus patients where you see a C3 deficiency, sometimes that is from overconsumption or overuse of the complement. So that is why you see a low C3. They are not immunodeficient. It would actually be advantageous probably for them to be a little immunodeficient. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that you generally dim the immune system, right? Because you don't want to invite the virus or inhibit the virus. So what makes it more complicated is, yes, if you get a virus and you have an autoimmune disease, it will usually provoke the autoimmune disease. And what made Miss de Vos' story so compelling is she also had lupus. So she got really sick. I mean, we had to fight off COVID and lupus. That being said, I mentioned that if you have lupus, well, if you get the virus, you can become sicker because you already have an overactive immune system. That doesn't necessarily mean you're at higher risk to get the virus, except if you're on an immunosuppressive drug to treat your autoimmune disease. Let's pick on lupus here. Let's say you have lupus or Sjogren's, and you take a disease modifying agent like steroids that generally dim the immune system, then that can invite the virus. That would be the worst of both worlds, because now you have dimmed the immune system to keep your lupus at bay, but you've invited the virus. And if that immunosuppressant doesn't hold your lupus, you're going to have a higher risk of getting the virus. You're going to paralyze the viral fighting mechanisms, and you're going to have the massive autoimmune response. So autoimmune disease does not give you a higher risk of getting the virus. If you get it, it could give you a higher risk of ending up on a ventilator or having a massive response. But if you're on an immunosuppressive medicine to treat your autoimmune disease and it inhibits viral protective mechanisms, which Solaris, the complement inhibitor, does not, by the way. That's one of the reasons why I like it. But if you are on a medicine that does inhibit antiviral or viral protective mechanisms, then yes, then you are at increased risk to get the virus. And then unfortunately, with a concomitant autoimmune disease, you can have this massive backlash from the immune system, like we talked about.
So if you were, and we're going to go in the if realm here, if you were an advisor to the president on health policy, what would be the general direction of recommendation for opening up the economy?
I think part of it is, first of all, we gotta, the number one way you open the economy, and I don't mean this any kind of political way, right? But the number one way you open the economy is take care of the virus. So there's two ways to take care of the viral problem. One is a vaccine. I mean, you can't eliminate it out of thin air. Vaccine, well, that's coming down the road. That's complicated. We have to prove safety. We have to biomedically engineer it. Those are in the works. We'll see. But I also looked at it like, well, if you stopped people from dying, which is kind of what my goal is, if I told you that let's say we changed it. I'm making this up. So let's say in a fantasy world, I make it so that only 1% of people on a ventilator die. Now that's obviously a very optimistic stretch. But let's say I did that, right? Let's say somehow that happened. So almost nobody dies from COVID anymore. I mean, do we shut down the entire world anymore? Probably not. I mean, we get sick all the time, from common colds and things like that. What makes COVID especially dangerous is that it's killed 100,000 Americans. Nobody talks about the people who get sick and don't die, right? That's not what scares people. What scares people is ending up on a ventilator and then knowing that when you're on a ventilator, you basically have an 87 to 97% chance of ending up in a coffin. That's why we care. So if we stop people from dying, that's what I want to do. So what I would, if somehow, President Trump or Dr. Fauci or someone hears this, please look at the immunosuppressive angle. You guys are going after the virus, and I'm not saying you shouldn't with a vaccine, but these antivirals, nobody treats Guillain-Barré, which is a virus that provokes the immune system. Nobody, 0 people in the world treat that with an antiviral. You treat that immune response with an immunosuppressive. We use IVIG or plasmapheresis. Please look at the immunosuppressive angle, specifically the complement, and get yourself a good immunologist on the team, please.
Sounds like wise words. Well, Dr. Pitts, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. It's been an honor covering you as well as this interview.
I appreciate it. You guys stay safe, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.